in extreme heat, we may not really understand what heat does to us, what heat does to our cattle and our livelihoods, and then what does extreme do to the environment, to even the infrastructures and the structures we live in. So I do think now is a good time to think about extreme heat potential and likelihood coming in the summer of 2024.
Extreme heat often results in the highest annual number of deaths among all weather-related disasters. In most of the U.S., extreme heat is a period of high heat and humidity with temperatures above 90 degrees, and it's becoming more of a health risk. On today's Sound Living, being prepared for extreme heat. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. With extreme heat incidences becoming more common, the Kansas Health Foundation's Distinguished Professor of Community Health at Kansas State University, Elaine Johannes, says it's important to be prepared, know how to be safe, and be able to recognize the signs and ways to treat heat-related illness. Elaine, you were able to recently attend an Eden conference. We'll let you explain what Eden is in just a moment, but part of the conference dealt with extreme heat, and it's something that we experience in Kansas, but maybe don't understand the full effects of what extreme heat can do.
Yes, Jeff, you're right. It was last month I had the privilege of being part of a Kansas team that attended what was called the Heartland Eden Conference, and Eden stands for Extension Disaster Education Network. And the Heartland Group is comprised of 4 states, the Midwest, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and us. And we had representatives from the FEMA office, the regional office, who gave talks about their role in addressing disaster response and disaster preparedness. And, Jeff, I was taken away by one of the FEMA persons talking about preparing for extreme heat. I hadn't really thought about extreme heat being a disaster of all sorts. And it got me to think about, yes, I remember the summer of 2023, and I remember that stifling heat that Manhattan and Chanute and Wichita and Kansas City and virtually the whole state and then the Midwest. And then I started to realize, gosh, maybe I had had just some heat stress. I like to think of myself as a gardener, and I like to think of myself as being prepared to go out and weed and take care of the plants. And I think during that time, I probably was outside doing gardening when I maybe shouldn't have been because of heat stress.
There are certain times when we should be outdoors and when we shouldn't be outdoors. And I think what we're talking about here is when we have 2, 3, or 4 or more days of this really extreme heat.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that is one thing that FEMA is monitoring. Of course, the whole world is monitoring that. The World Health Organization has been monitoring extreme heat incidents and then the frequency of those incidents and the duration, just what you've said, the long-term nature of extreme heat and how hot they are. And I think it's something that Kansans need to be prepared for. Eden is working on preparedness and also response. But in extreme heat, we may not really understand what heat does to us, what heat does to our cattle and our livelihoods, and then what does extreme do to the environment, to even the infrastructures and the structures we live in. So I do think now is a good time to think about extreme heat potential and likelihood coming in the summer of 2024.
So what are some things that we should do, I guess, right off the bat from a personal standpoint?
Yeah.
How do we protect ourselves first off?
Yeah. The proverbial frog in the boiling pot, maybe that's one thing that we need to be aware of. That story goes, the frog won't jump out of the pot if you incrementally heat it and then they boil to death. That's a terrible thought. But that's kind of what extreme heat does do if we don't pay attention. And if we aren't aware that these durations are long, the heat is hotter, much of it based on climate change and also where we live, learn, work, and play, has cement and those heat islands, which are really prevalent in urban areas. They not only retain heat, but they make the heat hotter. So first off, as a human being, I think understanding what heat does to us. no matter if we're in an urban environment or even a rural, because the heat does, again, it creates this dome. And we heard about heat domes where humidity keeps the heat anchored where we are working, if it's a farm or a ranch or downtown in Wichita. So I think the first thing is to understand, what does heat do to us as an individual? According to Jeff Goodall, who's one of the researchers and authors about heat, and his book came out last year, The Heat Will Kill You First. It's not a pleasant read, but it's an important one. He describes there's two kinds of heat that affects us negatively. One is just the classic heat stress. We may say that's heat exhaustion, and that is something that babies and young people that are maybe having chronic conditions, but older people with chronic conditions, or your dog that you left in the car. The classic heat stress, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and then hyperthermia, the cascade of that. We think about that kind of heat, and we have to be aware that if we have a condition, diabetes, chronic heart condition, we're older, or we have a young child, classic heat exhaustion to heat stroke and hyperthermia that leads to death, we need to be aware of. But then Jeff also writes about the exertional heat issues, and that exertional can be a very young, vibrant person who's an athlete, who's working outside frequently, those road workers, people that do agricultural work, people that think that they're, impervious to heat. That cascade can still happen. That cascade is due to our body is a little engine, right? And the heart pumps the blood, and we have an internal heat index per se. Most of us are around 98.6, around there. But when we feel heat inside, then that blood sometimes needs to circulate to cool us down, and that creates perspiration. And with air coming in, we cool ourselves down and we persevere. We go on. Well, if that mechanism is overstressed by not only internal trying to cool down, but then the external, it's that extreme heat issue. That extreme heat issue doesn't allow us to cool ourselves down. And our mechanism gets wacky. It gets overheated inside, and we can't notice that we're getting overheated, because then when we get overheated, sometimes our cognitive ability goes down. And if we're outside or working alone, then we can become delusional, we can become dizzy, and we can become not able to get help. And then if we can't cool down, we can't get help, and we don't understand that inside we're overheating to the point where bodily organs will shut down, cell structures start to melt, and honestly, Jeff, our blood starts to clot. I've learned too much.
Well, the point is we need to be aware of warning signs. We need to be aware that there is a good possibility on certain days that we could become overheated if we're out for too long of a period.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And not only ourselves, but the families, the friends, the people around us. FEMA recommends that we prepare. And it's kind of like, well, gosh, that may be far away in July or August. Yeah, but we need to be prepared. We need to first understand our own abilities and conditions that may make us more tend to overheat, and our behaviors. But then think about where we live. Are our homes, our apartments, are there shades? Are there ways that we can be aware that where we overheat in our housing, how do we cool that down? How do we make sure that if these heat domes, if this extreme heat continues like it's predicted over time, be prepared now. So when we do live in our structures and our structures aren't built for actually reflecting heat, then how do we keep ourselves safe inside the home? There was incidences in 2021, 2022 in Europe and in Paris, where, again, many of our European friends don't have air conditioning. It wasn't built for that. Well, when you have a sudden extreme heat incident and it's in duration, and then you have zinc roofs that retain the heat, and then people don't have any air conditioning or fans, death occurred. So, again, prepare for ourselves, prepare for our structures, and then for those that are working outside, taking care of cattle, taking care of work, or maintaining the homes of people who are trying to shelter. Make sure that you aren't working alone, that you have a way to connect with somebody who can monitor and who could say, hey, Jeff, hey, Elaine, you've been out here since 3 to 4 p.m., and it's 126, which Chanute, Kansas had in August. It's 126, and you're out here trying to mow the yard. How are you feeling? Now, water does count. Water is important, but by the time that we're starting to have heat stress and then heat exhaustion, hydration is part of it, but you got to cool that internal engine down. And you do that with cold showers and ice and placing that cold compresses in strategic places that the body can actually cool the blood down. I think the other thing about preparedness is being aware that we are not only responsible for ourselves and our loved ones and neighbors, the animals in our lives, but also the structures, how we're building now. I have the privilege of working with a group from landscape architecture here at K-State. They're students who are doing some really innovative landscaping and renderings about how can we change our environments. So these heat islands that are in these central cities, Kansas City, Topeka, Wichita, that are built around cement, how can we redesign those so that heat is not so intolerable? And Jeff, I'll say just one more thing about preparedness and what we should do. We should also think about the people who can't get out of the heat, people who don't have air conditioning and can't afford it, people who are unhoused, people who are living on the streets. Where in the world would they go unless there's a cooling center that is open in long enough duration that people can actually feel comfortable, go to, and be healthy?
Yeah, I know in a lot of communities that is either their senior center, their community center, or the library.
Yeah. And don't wait until the heat is on top of us to open those up. I think back in the summer of 2023, I think Lawrence was one of the communities who first started in this eastern part of the state to think about, okay, we need to have a cooling center. And then I think from that, a lot of other communities started thinking, this heat is intolerable. It's not just that short incremental. That's the other thing I think from the research and from what FEMA is trying to educate us all, and that's where Eden is important, is to be aware that maybe we grew up in heat. Maybe we understood it was a day at a time. We need to educate people that, no, this is different. This is something that seems to be something that we should be planning for. Duration, frequency of these extreme heat periods, and the heat itself, how hot they are. And we can prepare. We can prepare ourselves personally, our friends, neighbors, the animals that we take care of, and then also the structures we live and work in, but more importantly, how we design our communities.
And like you say, really being responsible and knowing what our neighbors are up against. And let's face it, we also are in a period where sometimes we have blackouts, we lose power. You also need to know what happens if you have air conditioning, but it's not working.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned the blackouts, the electrical grids. Jeff, I've learned too much. I had no idea how many people it takes to keep that grid going and how many people who are out there taking care of that grid, taking care of the electricity when it does go either a brownout or a blackout. We need to think about also the firefighters too. Anyone working outside, boy, when we think about heat and drought and then frequency of wildfires in this state too, think about the people fighting those and what they have to do internally to handle the heat themselves. So it's everybody's on deck. Again, it's a disaster that I had not become aware of until, thank goodness, I started paying attention to what FEMA's telling us and then the Eden Group. And I think Extension will probably be looking at this particular disaster more often because it's happening more often.
That's Elaine Johannes, the Kansas Health Foundation's Distinguished Professor of Community Health at Kansas State University. To learn more, contact your local Extension office or visit ready.gov/heat. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.